Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Good morning. My name is Leslie Reyes. I am the Policy Associate here at the Hope Center, and I will be your moderator for today. So welcome to today's expert panel discussion on supporting parenting students on college campuses. Today, we will have a robust conversation with our panelists on how institutions of higher education can best create a culture of support for student parents and offer state and federal policy solutions to make sure that student parents can access quality and affordable childcare. From what the Hope Center knows about student parents, we know that parenting students are a population on college campuses who are too often overlooked and left out of conversations surrounding support, yet would benefit from additional resources to reach their education aspirations. So in this session, we will focus on how we can address the childcare crisis and provide support to student parents. We will begin with a panel discussion and leave a couple minutes at the end for audience questions. You can use the chat function on this page to submit any comments or questions. Of course, we won't be able to get to every question, though we encourage you to engage with our fantastic community. So today we have a range of experts from institutional leaders to state and federal policy researchers and policymakers with wide experience in supporting parenting students. So to introduce up first, we have Dr. Kalani Palmer. She is an associate professor and director of the campus program at Indiana University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Palmer is a graduate of Carlisle College and the University of Pittsburgh, and is an associate professor with research focus on marginalized groups and parent involvement in supporting academic achievement. We also have with us Brittany Williams. She is a policy analyst at the Education Trust and supports the higher education policy team in researching, analyzing issues like college affordability and student success. She also supports efforts to communicate policy recommendations through various channels. Up next, we also have Dr. Carrie Gillespie. She's a senior pediatric research associate at the Education Trust, where she conducts quantitative and quantitative analysis and develops trust recommendations for national, state, and local policy and practice related to equity in early childhood education. We also have with us Lindsay Ruffin-Cruz. Lindsay is a senior fellow for postsecondary education at the National Skills Coalition, where she leads the organization's work on post-secondary education policy, particularly for adults with low incomes and access to public benefits, childcare, and holistic support for post-secondary students. And last but not least, we have Tanya Ange. She is the managing director of advocacy at the Higher Learning Advocates and comes with over 20 years of higher education experience, with much of that focused on identifying and promoting policies that best support ways to increase access and attainment for higher learning for all students. So thank you all for being here today with us to have this discussion on parenting students. And we're going to jump right into our questions. So Kalani, I want to start with you. As someone who currently works on college campuses and with students at Indiana University of Pennsylvania, would you be able to talk a bit more about your role? Who are the student parents on your campus, and what are some of the main barriers you see them face?
Yeah, so I am at one of the 14 state schools in Pennsylvania, and we are located in a rural area. Most of our students are in-state students, but we do have an international student population as well, and then some students that are from out of state. Most of our parenting students are graduate students, so it's about a little over 60% are graduate students. And when our undergraduates are parenting, they tend to be juniors and seniors. So I would say that they're probably starting school as a traditional student, and then they become pregnant. And so having that CCAMPIS grant here at our school helps to make sure that they don't leave or drop out and they're able to continue.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for providing that perspective. Brittany and Carrie, I want to go to you. You both recently worked on an amazing report highlighting the challenges of paying for both college and childcare and how these costs can make it harder for student parents to complete a degree. Would both of you be able to speak a bit more about what you found and what some of these barriers look like?
Absolutely, Leslie, and I'll start and I'll allow Carrie to jump in a bit. And so to give some perspective to how we came to the definition of our student parent affordability gap, back in 2019, the Education Trust released a report titled "How Affordable Are Public Colleges in Your State for Low Income Students?" And that report dispelled the myth that a student can work their way through college in a minimum and have a minimum wage job. And so in continuation of that work with support from Imaginable Futures and in partnership with Generation Hope, we conducted a similar analysis, but this time with our parent and students perspective. And we defined our student parent affordability gap as the published net price of an institution plus the cost of childcare cost. We looked at home-based and center-based childcare, and minus the income earned from working 10 hours per week. And we chose that number 10 in relationship with Lumina's rule of 10 that says a student pursuing post-secondary education should work no more than 10 hours a week to eliminate any academic barriers that they, persistence barriers that they may encounter.
And I'll just add that, of course, net price alone isn't a good indicator of college affordability, of course, for student parents, because childcare is astronomically expensive because of our country's lack of a cohesive early childhood system. So the number of hours that a student parent has to work to afford college and childcare, it varies widely, but it's always too high. And it also depends on their state's minimum wage.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for providing that perspective. It definitely was an eye-opening to see the added barriers and expenses that come with just being a student parent. So thank you for sharing that. I'd like to turn it over a little bit to Lindsay and Tanya. You both have been really strong advocates for parenting students in your work and have contributed to so much research and conversations to push these issues forward. Would you be able to speak a bit, either nationally or in your work, about what are some of the main barriers you have seen?
Sure. Thanks, Leslie. I can start and then I'll pass it to Tanya. So I think, the new Ed Trust report is really enlightening and really crystallizes some of the cost pressures that student parents face. But what our research has also shown is that affordability is very much financial, but it also encompasses a whole other range of factors in folks' lives that allow them to pursue education and training to begin with. You have to have the time and the mental health and the care for your kids, kind of all the factors, all the elements that make it possible for someone to go to college have to be in line. And for student parents who are largely living with low or poverty level incomes, who live with a number of different identities that can put them in situations where they're facing systemic barriers that make it much harder for them to access and move through the system. All of that can be a lot harder to put together, a lot harder to balance. And that means that student parents' journeys through the post-secondary system are very nonlinear, and they start and stop, and they often take a long time, which is hard to track because we don't have great data describing this population to begin with. So I think to the extent that we can characterize what student parents experience in a generalized way, I think it's thinking about how student parents cobble together all of these different supports and resources that they're able to access to make it work to get through higher education. And the fact that a majority of student parents are students of color, with Black and Indigenous women particularly likely to be parenting, and that combined with the fact that supports for student parents are not a given on college campuses at this point. That's changing slowly and bit by bit, campus by campus, but the lack of intentionally designed supports with student parents in mind, I think, is still a major gap that can make it hard for parents to even see themselves in the post-secondary space to begin with. And we know that for states and the federal government, reaching 60% or higher college attainment is essential, and parents are a big part of that. So thinking about how we can build systems that are more supportive and promote student parents' ability to access college is really essential. So I'll pass it to Tanya.
Thanks, Lindsay. I second everything she said. When you're looking at the many different barriers that parenting students face, there are so many. It's like really hard to identify just one particular one. So You have, even with access to like childcare that's going to be supportive of their education talent, their education timeline. So, transportation to school, the time that it takes to get to school, then getting to school, and then also having to study. And then you look at like if a child is sick and the parent has to miss class, or, there's so many of these different pieces that go into the barriers or the challenges that parents and students face. And however, if you look at the data, when these barriers are addressed and when students have the support that they need, they actually do really well in school. Academically, they do well. And then once they're through, as Lindsay has said, it's a bunch of hits of stops and starts often, not always, but more often than not, they're going to be facing that. But once they do finish, the return on investment for parenting students once they're through is significant as far as what they're able to contribute to our economy, what they're able to then pass on to their children, and then that lifetime legacy will kind of continue through those parents at that point. And so, there are barriers, and Lindsay did a great job of really highlighting all of those. But I think as we're having these conversations, looking at not just the deficit side of it, but what is the return on investment for investing and helping remove these barriers is really key to the conversation as well.
Got it. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that for all of you. I think it really, does a really good job of looking at the parent student holistically and really takes into consideration the many barriers that come with, being a parenting student, from, facing systemic barriers to time commitments and high costs that childcare plays into it, and the lack of data that we just don't have to truly understand what is happening on every college campus. And I want to shift the conversation a bit to begin talking about solutions that could help address at least some of these barriers. Federal programs, supports like Campus and CCDF have been a targeted avenue of advocacy, as they, have been shown to really provide support to student parents. But I'm curious to know more from you all's perspective about how the role that these programs play in the conversation of connecting students to childcare. For instance, how do they support student parents, and to what extent do they actually address the childcare needs of parenting students? And this could be open to anybody who wants to jump in.
I can start. So for us, we have students where CCGF is not a viable option because they can't meet the work requirement. So as some of the other panelists mentioned, it's really difficult to work and go to school full time. So the work requirement becomes a concern. Their spouse, if they are married, might not work, which also prevents them from being able to access CCDF. We're in a rural area, but transportation is an issue in urban areas as well. So being able to get to school and to the child care center, and maybe they have an older child that is, going to a different location. So having these multiple stops in the morning is challenging. And just in a rural area in general, everything is not accessible by public transportation. So if you don't have a car, transportation is really a barrier that's difficult to overcome. And then so CCAMPIS sort of fills the gap there for CCDF because we don't have a work requirement. We try to partner with childcare centers that are very close to the campus. And so that sort of aids with the transportation issue, but transportation is still a concern for us. We also are able to, we have students who are fully online, which sometimes can help with the transportation issue, whereas CCDF has restrictions that would not allow for students to be fully online and be able to use it, at least in our state. I know each state manages that differently. So we are less restrictive than CCDF, which makes us more accessible to some of our students.
Yeah, I definitely think that CCDF needs, like, if CCDF has the potential of offering something that CCAMPIS can't, I think that you need both, right? So CCAMPIS offers that on-campus opportunity for parents to bring their children. But one, it's very challenging for campuses to stand up a child care center. I have worked on a campus and we tried for years to stand one up, and the hoops that we had to jump through in order to get there, we were never able to get there. So there's that piece that can potentially get in the way. Additionally, if a student has to spend time studying, or if their child is sick, or they need something that's like, if there are transportation issues, like closer to home, or to where their other children are maybe going to elementary or middle school, it's, like there's so many different pieces to the puzzle that you do need both, but both of them have their challenges. I think the other big challenge that you see is lack of funding for both CCAMPIS and CCDF. For CCDF, you're looking at 1 in 7 parents are eligible for it, which is significant. And if we're going to be using CCDF, then we need to change those requirements so that they're not just focused on workforce requirements, but they're incorporating the parent who's going to school and is trying to get the education necessary to be able to provide a better, a better opportunity for their family socioeconomically. So I think both areas have their pluses and their minuses.
Just to piggyback off of what Tanya said, so we will partner with any site, so they don't have to be near the campus. So I think CCAMPIS is a little more flexible than, and our university doesn't actually have. There's a childcare center on campus, but we don't own or operate it. So they're a nonprofit, and for the reasons you described, our university could not take on the responsibility and the liability of managing a childcare center. So I completely agree with Tanya there, but I think they're a little more flexible, but we don't have the funds that CCDF has. And so they're able to cover more. And so I agree with that too, that we need both. And really, I think for both, we need more funding. So for CCAMPIS, originally it was limited to 1% of the Pell Award given to your institution. They recently raised that. So the competition this year, they were able to request up to 3%. But that's still, not everyone completes the FAFSA. So not everyone who would meet the income guidelines are being included in that Pell Award amount. So I do think a funding increase would be useful for both CCDF and CCAMPIS.
And I would just add that the childcare sector in general is going through such dramatic changes. It's been decimated from the pandemic and from not paying childcare workers enough money or giving them benefits. And so it's even more challenging now to find childcare, to find high quality childcare, to give childcare centers the funding and resources they need to remain high quality, and to just find people willing to work these jobs that pay so very little for such hard, important work. So that, I think, has to be part of the conversation with policymakers, because even if you can access subsidies and use them for a portion of your childcare, if there's no childcare to go to, that's a huge problem.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives. And, staying on the conversation about funding, Tanya, this past April, the Higher Learning Advocates, along with other various organizations like the Education Trust, sent a letter to Congress asking for an increase in campus funding to $500 million. Would you be able to talk a little bit more about how this additional funding would help, a bigger portion of parenting students, or just talk a little bit more about what this request was talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So for us, if you're looking at like increasing the funding right now, it's only because the pot is so small. It only goes to a limited number of students and a limited number of schools. And so when you have so many more schools that are out there, and you have I think the parenting student numbers are potentially low at this point, because, as Lindsay had said earlier, our data and our ability to track the number of parenting students is not great right now. And so we're only going based off of the basic data that we have, and not knowing how many might be self-identifying, or there's just a lot that we don't know. And so by expanding the amount of money to the 500 million, we're going to be able to increase access to a larger number of students. And so for us, we feel like that's a key component to helping parenting students be able to remove that barrier. I mean, there are other barriers, as we've talked about, related to higher ed, but if we can kind of start the process of addressing that, then it's gonna significantly increase access and opportunity for parents and students.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for sharing that. And aside from further investment in these programs, what are some other federal or even state policy solutions that would help ensure that federal public benefit programs are actually reaching a great number of students? You all touched a little bit about, some of the barriers that come with it. So what would be some, on the other side, some solutions to that?
So this is something that is it's probably one of my soapboxes, and I'm going to say it, and then I'm sorry, I don't mean to keep talking over my colleagues, but students are filling out the FAFSA, and we have access to where their financial status is. If you have students who are eligible for Pell Grant, they're going to be eligible for a lot of other benefits that are going to help them. And so we need to find a way to kind of help bridge that gap so that students aren't having to apply for this and then for this and then for this and then for this. And I don't always I don't know the full answer to that, but we have the data available, so why are we not utilizing it more? My second one is more about when you go to campuses, they're still very much focused on those 18 to 20-year-olds or 18 to 22-year-olds that are going to school. And so when you look at campus housing, you often don't see housing that's for families. And so then that also then means that these parents are trying to, maybe they are moving to go to school somewhere. I spoke with a student veteran. I supported student veterans for the last number of years, and he had to move separate from his family to go to a school and live on campus at that school. They didn't have the online learning option because there was no family housing in the area, and they couldn't afford the housing cost around that area. And so for 4 years, he was going to be going to school completely separate from his family. That's sad. Your kids, they're only so young for so long, and then they're gone. So I'll step back.
I do just want to kind of add really quickly to the conversation around what states and campuses and even at the federal level could be doing now. A part of our recommendations in the report that EdTrust recently released sit across federal, state, and campus spaces. And so specifically around data collection. And so Tanya touched on that a little bit, just identifying who are the parenting students on the campus and then scale that upwards in reporting. And so we've seen recently last year, Oregon and Illinois both have, passed some legislation around public higher education institutions beginning to survey those students on their campuses to find out exactly who are the parenting students. And I think from that data collection, we can move towards a better space for supporting, parenting students and even, beginning at that admissions process. I think that this is an admissions barrier. We should be collecting this data very early in the conversation, and then we can move into setting legislation and things in place to better support our parenting students in degree completion.
And I'll just jump in. I totally agree with all of that about the data collection. It's essential. But one point I wanted to share was just, I think the importance of understanding that because our childcare system is essentially broken and does not have the federal investment, the public investment it needs to function the way families need. We, meaning the federal government, states, and institutions, have to think about how partnerships and leveraging existing programs and funding streams can be knitted together to support students' childcare needs in a more meaningful way. And there are programs like Head Start, which is has a mission to help families establish self-sufficiency in addition to providing very high quality early childhood education. Over 2 in 5 student parents are income eligible for that program. And we know from other research that's been conducted that they are likely to be eligible in other ways as well. So that program has childcare services built in. It has family engagement services that provide coaching and case management for parents, building partnerships with college campuses, And having state and federal guidance and support for how to do that could help bridge some of those gaps where you're leveraging a system that's already in place and functioning to help support families and understanding where the linkages to college might be benefiting those families' well-being and mobility. Another really underutilized program for this purpose is SNAP ENT. There are reimbursement grants that allow for federal reimbursement of up to 50% of costs spent on supportive services for SNAP recipients. That means that you can essentially reinvest that 50% reimbursement back into how you provide services and ultimately you can eventually fund an entire program or supportive service provision for student parents just using the federal reimbursement funds, and those are uncapped funds. So there are other programs out there, and all of them are underfunded and all of them are not enough to meet the need. But I think being creative and understanding the fact that student parents sit in all of these different systems, from workforce development to community college, higher ed, childcare, Head Start, all of these public assistance systems and others, there are student parents in all of them, and fitting them together in a way that can create a stronger web of support is where we need to be moving right now in lieu of a massive public investment in our childcare system. So that's my soapbox. I'll get off now.
I think another barrier that we've experienced, because we try to connect all of those pieces. So I like when Lindsay talked about sort of working together with what already exists. But for like our state funded preschool program and for Head Start, one of the issues that we find is when they're located at a site that doesn't also have wrap care or childcare. So their programs will end at like 3:00 and they only start at 9. And so it creates another challenge trying to piece that together if there isn't wrap care available in the morning or in the afternoon. So we try to do that when we can, but one of the barriers we found with doing that is that it's not holistic in terms of where it's located. And so it might create more challenges for the parents to try to use that plus, transporting them somewhere else. And then in terms of, I like the discussion around like college campuses are not family friendly. I agree. So I work for an institution. And so I think like rethinking the space on campus really needs to happen. And I mean, like from housing, so definitely with housing, I was a parenting student. Housing was an issue for me. Feeling connected to my university was an issue for me. Those are issues that parenting students still have. And so I think like having activities during orientation and throughout the semester that are family focused is one way to rethink those spaces. And you can make it open to the community that the college exists in. Like it doesn't have to be just for your students on campus. Like just create activities that are supportive of families in your area, wherever your campus is located. I have a good example of an institution doing that. It was a long time ago in the late 90s when I was an undergrad. But at Carlow, it was Carlow College at the time, now it's Carlow University. At Halloween, all of the students who lived in the dorms would decorate their floors. They would decorate like the lounge at the ground floor, and people from the community could come in and trick or treat. And they would play like Scooby-Doo Halloween movies. And so it's like a way of connecting the university with the families in the community. But I happen to be a student that was also able to access that. So it made me feel, supported and welcomed at my institution. So I think doing more things like that will help with students having that sense of belonging.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Kalani. I think that, blends really well into my next question, of talking about what other avenues outside of benefit programs that we can create, this culture of care for our parenting students and, really do what we can in other avenues when you don't have the funding, to support parenting students. So, anybody who wants to, feel free to jump in with recommendations, what other things you all think are things that people should be thinking about.
I just kind of want to jump in first and say thank you for sharing that, Dr. Palmer. I too was a parenting student in my undergrad studies and as well as my graduate studies. And I think one of the biggest things for me and for the interviews that we facilitated when we initiated this research project was that students don't feel welcome on campus, or they don't feel like they have a space. And so when you said, we need to rethink this space on, campus spaces, literally, I think that we have student support services, TRIO programs. We have, multicultural spaces on campus and veteran spaces on campus. And I would have loved to have a space where I could go as a pregnant and parenting student on campus and just sit down and talk to my peers, and tell them about my day or how hard it was to put the baby to sleep last night and then have to work on a paper. And so I think definitely, physical spaces on campus, but also like that student support component so that, academic support and support around scheduling and just meeting with professors in off-peak hours, things like that the campus could, kind of initiate in real time to support students. Those are the, maybe education adjacent or parenting adjacent pieces that we could incorporate to help our parenting students pursue and persist through their degree programs.
I would also kind of touch on the career advising piece and how are we helping advise parenting students on what's out there, what's available for them, so that they're not just narrowed into X, Y, and Z fields. Generation Hope just came out with their report yesterday, which really highlights this. And again, I see so many similarities between like the military connected student population and the parenting student population. And I think it boils down to, we have a continuing growing number of adult students who are returning back to school. And so it's great that we have all of these programs and services for 18 through 22-year-olds, but how are we adjusting the conversation to help adults that are saying, look, I'm here, I need to finish my degree so I can get promoted or so I can change my career, especially as you're seeing people looking to and upskill, and you look at the great resignation that's, kind of come from COVID, is how are we helping then students find viable careers that are going to provide a strong return on investment and really truly help them change the trajectory for their family.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that. I think that's a great point, Tanya. In my work now, we're looking a lot at how states are investing and making skills training and post-secondary pathways more affordable. And what we're learning is that for folks, there's a lot of state investment through employer-oriented grants that support things like customized training and short-term training for folks to reskill, upskill in their current jobs or for prospective jobs. But those folks are not getting connected into supportive services or coaching, career navigation, or understanding how you can parlay that pathway into something that's credit bearing and that can lead to additional educational opportunities. And I think that's something that we're really missing, because I think while there's not great data on this, that parents are plugging into the system through these skills training opportunities, either through their employers to advance their careers, and we're missing out on folks who could really benefit from more structured and intentional support for themselves and their families as they work along that career pathway or journey, I should say, and looking to post-secondary education as a way to do that. So I'll just share that here.
Yeah, we too are with it, Lindsay. We too are starting out the campaign called Widen the Path, that's looking at how can, the trajectory to and through college is not always a straight line. It's a lot of stops and starts and ebbs and flows. And how can we ensure that training continues to build upon each other to give high quality post-secondary training wherever a student goes.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all for sharing. And that kind of leads me to my next question. You all talked about how, there's very different, higher education is not linear for a lot of students. And I think a lot of people are beginning to really see that and understand that, especially like policymakers and institutional leaders. And, for those of us joining us today, my next question would be, what are your recommendations for how people can get involved in this space? We talked a little bit about federal programs, but like Lindsay mentioned, there's a lot other areas that we should also be looking into to kind of embed together to provide this foundation of support for parenting students. So what would be your recommendations for people wanting to get involved in advocacy for parenting students and want to get involved, to really make a change that we want to see?
So my first recommendation is to spread the word. There's not a lot of conversation around parenting students happening. September is National Student Parents Month, and this is the second year that we're celebrating that. And so September is a great time to start sharing with policymakers at the federal and at the state level, and with institutional administrators about parenting students and the strong return on investment that can happen for these students, but also then why that supports creating and the necessary supports, and also removing barriers that impede a student's ability to complete their program of study.
I think in thinking about funders or government agencies that fund this kind of work, I think that they should look at planning grants. So one way to ensure that all stakeholders are present and invested is to put money behind that collaborative planning. And so we've seen that happen with early childhood education, where there's funding that's put towards collaborative grants, so that it's not just higher education that's sort of driving the conversation about how to train early childhood educators, but that those in the community that are doing the direct service and hands-on work are part of that discussion in a meaningful way. So I think putting funding with targeted outcomes, with guidelines around you have to have X number of stakeholders at the table, will help sort of drive that. I know it's saying put more money behind it, but at least it's putting money into the activities that will actually lead to people not being siloed and people having those discussions with the other people doing the similar work. So I think planning grants are a good way to jumpstart that collaborative process.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point, Kalani. I think the more we can put student parents at the center, the better. Having student parents tell us what they want, need, and are experiencing, and what they want and need from their policy and education leaders, that needs to be our North Star. And I think that should be our North Star for advocacy organizations who are doing this, who are having these conversations with policymakers. How do we learn from and inform our positions from parents who are the ones living this, who are on the ground where the rubber meets the road? And I think to that point too, the student facing staff who are navigating these policies in different ways to support student parents, they also have a really unique and an essential perspective for how we think about policy at the 30,000 feet level. And then the other thing I'll just add is I think that there definitely is a silo. It's breaking up a little bit as this conversation has progressed over the last few years, but there's silos in how we think about, like, we talk about student parent data collection all the time in the student parent movement, but it's not, that conversation is not as plugged in as it could be with the other higher education data conversations that are happening. And there's a lot of investment and a lot of other stakeholders in that space at the state level, at the federal level. And all of us should be aligning on our conversations to better meet our goals, not just for data. That's just one example, but I think that stands in a number of sectors.
I would add to that. I think that's such a good point. In the early childhood space, that's not something I hear about a lot. And there's a lot of talk about making early childhood data better for all the reasons we're describing, to make the system better and better understand inequities. But I don't hear often enough that one of the key factors is collecting data on student parents. So that's really interesting to hear.
So we are going to move into the Q&A aspect of this portion. So if anybody has any questions that they would like to submit, now is your time to do so. And while we transition to that, I have another question for our panelists. So this was something we've sort of started to think about at the Hope Center just because of, recent things have been coming out. So another aspect of this conversation is abortion care. I know we have a whole session dedicated to this topic, but I'd love to hear more about, what does this mean for the parenting students on our campus? With the growing number of abortion bans reaching states across the country, how do y'all think this will affect our parenting student population on campus? If any.
I'll jump in and just to start, some of my work in my previous role was focused on reproductive health access for community college students and how essential that is for making sure that students have all the tools, resources, information, and care they need to be successful college students. And I think for parents, it's even more essential. I think it's potentially going to increase the student parent population, which means there's a greater urgency and imperative for federal, state, and institutional policy and services that support student parents and create a system that works better for those families. But also, people need to have the ability to make a choice about whether or not they want to start or grow a family and when they want to do that. And that's imperative for folks who are interested in college or the post-secondary space who are currently enrolled. And there needs to be a choice so that they can determine how they want to move through those spaces and what that looks like. And I think it's incredibly harmful to how students are able to access care. And again, it creates a great urgency for campuses to understand how they need to be supporting their students both with and without kids. And I'll just say that it also creates a real need. I mean, there was already a huge need to increase funding for institutions who are chronically underfunded, like community colleges, HBCUs, minority serving institutions, and tribal colleges and others, because like community colleges, for example, are much, much, much less likely to have health centers on campuses. They just don't have the funds to operate that type of service. Students aren't residential in the same way. So, but we also know that those populations are of childbearing age, and most student parents attend community colleges. So there's a gap there. We need to start connecting the dots in a more holistic way. And the impact that ruling has had on students' rights and ability to make that choice puts a lot of pressure on the system to get better real fast.
Yeah, if you look at the data, 70% of student parents are women, and women parenting students that are women are more likely to be single parents than parenting students that are men. And so I think that is that shows first of all, there does need to we need to make sure that women have that choice, have the ability to make those decisions. But then also, if that's going to be limited, then we have to ramp up support services. There's just no choice. We're cutting off our nose to spite our face.
Definitely. Thank you so much for sharing. And we do have a question that came in, so I will open it up to anybody who wants to jump in. So someone says, I work at a community college in Oregon, where we have begun conversations about opening a low-cost childcare center for students. Can you describe some of the difficulties you found when trying to open a center on your campuses?
A lot of red tape. Every state has its own requirements as far as what you need to have for a child care center. And for us at the school I worked at, it was a very small institution. It was on the property of a church that had a whole child care area that we thought would be possible to do to build out a center there. But the number of things we had to put in place, it was going to cost so much money. And then even then, after we made all of those changes, it was there was just the red tape. It was going to take years and years and years to get approved. And so those were our biggest challenges.
Yeah, at my institution, they have not attempted to open their own childcare center. That would it would increase staff, it would increase costs. I mean, really, I think it's a financial issue, but also, you know, you have to have people that have an expertise in that to meet the regulatory guidelines to make sure that it's a high quality center. And so that it opens up more challenges for the university. So we have found that it is more beneficial because they do recognize the importance of having that accessible to faculty, staff, and students. So we provide financial support, and we provide space, and we provide, you know, janitorial services, resources, cash support for salary. So it's financially a better solution for them to partner with an existing childcare center and support their work rather than try to create their own.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you, Tanya, and thank you, Kalani, for sharing. And so while we wait for more questions to come in, where can people find you? If people wanted to reach out, where can they find your reports, your work? Who can they contact? Things like that.
So ours is higherlearningadvocates.org is our website, and my email is Tang, like the drink Tang, for those of you who remember that drink, at higherlearningadvocates.org, and I'm happy to chat with anyone who wants to talk.
My email is kpalmer, PALMER at iup.edu, and I'm in the Professional Studies and Education Department at IUP, Indiana University of Pennsylvania. So if you go on their website, my contact information is there as well.
Both Dr. Kiri Gillespie and I can be found at edtrust.com. I'm sorry, edtrust.org. Oh my goodness. We house all of our reports and future reports that will be coming out around this topic, and you can contact us through that website as well.
And I'm happy, you know, to receive emails. My email is Lindsey, LINDSEYRC at nationalskillscoalition.org. And that's also on our website, nationalskillscoalition.org.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone. And since we don't have any questions, I think we can begin to close out our session, unless anybody has any last minute remarks that they want to, you know, say.
I do want to say, because the panel does great work around advocacy and policy change. And this seems like a small thing, but it's a huge obstacle in some ways for CCAMPIS. That, you know, the announcements are typically posted in May or June, and you're notified of the award in late August or September. And you all know that the semester starts in August for most universities. And so, like, moving that up, it seems small, but moving that up would make those programs function better, because when you're at that 4-year point where you're renewing your grant and you don't know if it's going to be funded, like, we are scrambling around trying to make sure that our families are taken care of. And so it would just function better. It would function smoother if we knew in like May whether we were funded, so that the summer we could, you know, let people know you're going to be okay and you can continue. So it seems like a small thing, but just moving up those dates and the notification would make those programs run more smoothly.
I will say also, Kalani, you talked a lot about the challenge with transportation, and we have been working on a bill called the Path to College Act, that I think people are going to be tired of me talking about it, and that's okay. They can get tired. They can be tired, but I'm going to keep talking about it until it gets passed. But it actually expands access to public transportation and works.
Tanya, you muted yourself.
My computer seems to randomly mute itself, and I don't even understand why, so apologies. So it works with institutions for higher learning to build out like local stops, increase transportation the like transportation routes so that it's more conducive to school schedules, and then also offers grants. So that's something that we're really pushing because yeah, if you can't get to school, you can't complete your program. So.
And I would add that I would just keep an eye on all the early childhood education legislation going forward. It's an unprecedented time for early childhood education legislation. We've gotten so close to groundbreaking laws being passed, close but not passed. But if we can just get some of this legislation through, it could mean such a world of difference for all parents, but especially for student parents. So I would just encourage folks to learn more about what's going on in their state and just keep an eye on early childhood policy and advocacy, because it really could make a huge difference.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you all for sharing that. It's really important, as we do have audience members here, and hopefully, we're able to get involved to really build a movement forward. And so thank you all for participating in today's session on parenting students.